The record book saved from the Lancaster County Agricultural Office fire of 1972 showed 30 months of prisoner work agreements. Most entries followed the same patterns. Family farms asking for 2 or 3 workers, normal pay, proper housing written down. The entry for August 15, 1944 stood alone on its page, marked in red ink with notes no one could later explain. Helga Bruner's agreement asked for 1 prisoner, just one for 400 acres of productive Nebraska farmland that usually needed 6 full-time workers during harvest season. The War Manpower Commission's farm labor program had brought thousands of German prisoners of war to the American heartland by the summer of 1944. The official rule seemed simple enough. Put enemy soldiers to useful work, ease the terrible farm worker shortage, keep proper Geneva Convention standards. County farm offices handled agreements with mechanical speed, matching prisoners to farms based on size and need. Mrs. Bruner's application arrived in early August. The worker handling it, a man named Donald Yost, who would later struggle to remember the details, remembered seeing her in the office. She stood 6 feet 3 inches tall with shoulders wider than most men in the county and hands that had worked 4 decades of brutal farm labor. Her husband had died 18 months earlier, leaving her alone with land that stretched to every horizon. She wanted 1 prisoner. She was very specific about this requirement. The agreement she signed had unusual additions: private housing arrangement instead of standard prisoner barracks, limited movement rules, separated work assignment. The clerk added these notes without questioning why they were needed. Mrs. Bruner's reputation as a tough woman who managed her property with iron discipline seemed reason enough. Prisoner 477 arrived at the Bruner farm on August 21, 1944. Werner Gottschalk, 23 years old, captured in France 3 months earlier. His military records described him as slightly built, 5 feet 8 inches, 140 pounds. The transport officer who delivered him later told his wife the prisoner looked terrified when Mrs. Bruner came out of her farmhouse to receive him. The officer's report noted proper prisoner transfer steps followed. He wrote down appropriate housing prepared, enough food supplies present, work equipment available. Everything appeared to follow regulations. He drove away satisfied with the arrangement, watching in his rearview mirror as the tall widow led the small German prisoner toward her house. What he couldn't write down, what existed nowhere in official records, was the length of heavy chain Mrs. Bruner carried in her other hand, coiled like rope and shining in the August sun. By the time anyone thought to ask about such details, it was already too late for Werner Gottschalk to tell them what happened next. Werner's first letter home arrived through Red Cross channels on September 3, 1944. His family in Bavaria kept every word. He described the farm with careful detail: 400 acres of corn and wheat, livestock barns kept with Germanic precision, equipment newer than what most Nebraska farms could afford. Mrs. Bruner ran her operation alone, he wrote, and her physical strength was remarkable. She could lift feed sacks that needed 2 men elsewhere. The letter mentioned his housing situation only briefly. He lived in the main farmhouse instead of separate quarters. Bruner explained this as practical given the property's distance from others and security concerns. His second letter, dated September 18th, described the landscape differently. The cornfields grew tall enough by late summer to create walls of green that blocked sight lines in every direction. The nearest neighbor lived 8 miles east. No roads crossed the property. Mrs. Bruner received mail delivery once weekly, supplies delivered monthly. Werner wrote that he hadn't seen another person since his arrival, except for the widow herself. He stopped mentioning fieldwork after that second letter. A farmhand named Eugene Dalton, who delivered diesel fuel to the Bruner property in early October, later gave a statement to investigators that went nowhere. He remembered knocking on the farmhouse door for 20 minutes before Mrs. Bruner answered. She seemed upset, blocked his view inside, insisted on moving their business to the equipment barn. While signing the delivery receipt, Dalton glanced through the farmhouse window. He saw what looked like leg irons bolted to a support beam in what looked like the main bedroom. When he asked about them, Mrs. Bruner explained they were for holding difficult livestock during veterinary procedures. Dalton accepted this. He had no reason not to. Farmers used all kinds of homemade equipment for animal handling. He noticed one other detail he couldn't quite figure out. The irons were mounted at a height right for a standing human, not a cow or horse lying on the ground. Werner's third letter arrived on October 9th. The tone had changed. He wrote about Mrs. Bruner's routines, her expectations, the strict schedule she kept. He mentioned that she was teaching him proper household management. His family found this wording strange. Prisoners of war worked fields and did manual labor. They didn't learn household management from their captors. The letter had one sentence that his mother underlined many times in later years. She says, "I am safer here than I would be anywhere else," and perhaps this is true. By November, Werner's letters stopped describing his daily activities completely. He wrote only about weather, about news from the war front that Mrs. Bruner shared with him, about hoping his family stayed safe. The letters grew shorter. His handwriting, previously neat and controlled, became cramped and irregular. A postal carrier who served the rural route later recalled delivering letters addressed to Werner at the Bruner farm. She never once saw the German prisoner, though she made deliveries there twice monthly through the winter of 1944. Bruner always met her at the mailbox at the property line, accepted the letters personally, handed over Werner's outgoing letters, already sealed and stamped. The carrier mentioned this oddity to her supervisor once. Weren't prisoners of war supposed to have regular contact with camp authorities? Weren't there rules about isolation? Her supervisor reminded her that the War Manpower Commission handled such arrangements. Everyone was busy. The system was overwhelmed. If Mrs. Brunner said everything was proper, then it probably was. Werner's last letter that mentioned outdoor work was dated September 22, 1944. After that, for 15 months, he wrote from somewhere inside that farmhouse while the corn grew tall enough to hide whatever was happening behind those walls. The War Department inspection report, made public in 1989, landed on a junior officer's desk in November 1944. Lieutenant Raymond Kowalski drew the assignment to check compliance at 17 farms across Lancaster County. The Brunner property was 14th on his list. He arrived unannounced on November 28th. Standard procedure. Mrs. Brunner met him at the door with coffee already prepared, as if she'd been expecting exactly this visit on exactly this day. She walked him through the property with confidence. The barns were spotless. Equipment was properly kept. Food stores exceeded minimum requirements. She showed Werner's work logs showing appropriate hours and tasks. Everything appeared according to regulations. Kowalski asked to interview the prisoner privately. Mrs. Brunner led him to the main house. Werner was sitting in the front room when they entered. He stood immediately, but his movement was wrong. Too careful, too measured. Kowalski's eyes went to his ankles. The marks were visible even through his work pants. Dark lines of abraded skin where something heavy had rubbed repeatedly. Mrs. Brunner explained before Kowalski could ask. Werner had tried to escape twice. The restraints were necessary security measures for a high-risk prisoner. She showed paperwork supporting her claim incident reports she'd filed with the county sheriff, recommendations for stronger security rules. Kowalski looked at Werner's ankles more closely. The abrasion suggested long-term wear, not occasional use. He made notes. When Mrs. Brunner left them alone, Kowalski asked Werner directly about his treatment. The prisoner's response was strange. He spoke in English now, grammatically perfect but oddly formal. He said the arrangement was acceptable. He preferred staying here to returning to the prisoner camp. The conditions were adequate. Mrs. Brunner treated him fairly. His hands shook while he spoke. His eyes never met Kowalski's. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November cold. Kowalski pushed harder. Was Werner being properly fed? Yes. Was he getting enough rest? Yes. Did he feel safe? A long pause. Then yes. The lieutenant asked to see Werner's sleeping quarters. Mrs. Brunner reappeared immediately as if she'd been listening from the next room. She led them upstairs to a small bedroom with a single bed, a wash basin, and a chair. Everything appeared appropriate except for one detail Kowalski couldn't ignore. The door locked from the outside. Mrs. Brunner explained this was standard security for housing enemy prisoners. Kowalski had inspected 16 other farms. None of them locked prisoners in their sleeping quarters. He returned to Werner's ankles in his questioning. How often were the restraints used? Werner glanced at Mrs. Brunner before answering. Only during high-risk periods at night, sometimes when she needed to leave the property. Kowalski's report documented irregularities in housing arrangements. He noted visible signs of psychological distress. He recorded the restraint marks and the locked sleeping quarters. His recommendation was clearly immediate reassignment to standard prisoner barracks. The report went up the chain of command. It returned 3 weeks later with a single word stamped across the recommendation section: deferred. The explanation came in a memo attached to the file. Critical labor shortage. Farm production priority. Mrs. Brunner's farm was one of the most productive in the county. The prisoner himself had said he preferred the current arrangement. Reassignment would disrupt food supply operations at a critical time in the war effort. Lieutenant Kowalski filed his copy of the report and moved on to his next assignment. He later told Army investigators that Werner Gottschalk's face haunted him for years afterward. The prisoner had looked at him with something beyond fear. It was resignation, the expression of someone who knew rescue wasn't coming and had stopped hoping for it. The first complaint arrived at the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office on December 7, 1944. Pastor Wilhelm Schneider from the Lutheran Church in Hallam wrote that Werner Gottschalk had stopped attending prisoner chapel services. The camp allowed Sunday religious observance for German prisoners. Werner had attended faithfully through September, then disappeared. Deputy Frank Hartmann drove out to investigate on December 10th. Mrs. Brunner explained that Werner had requested private worship. She gave him a Bible and allowed him prayer time on Sundays. The prisoner confirmed this when questioned. His voice was flat, rehearsed. Deputy Hartmann noted nothing actionable and closed the complaint. 3 weeks later, the mail carrier filed her own report. She'd been delivering to rural routes for 11 years. She knew what prisoner labor looked like. Prisoners worked outdoors in winter, clearing snow, maintaining equipment, tending livestock. She had never once seen Werner Gottschalk outside the farmhouse during daylight hours, despite passing the property dozens of times. Sheriff Clayton Merrick handled this complaint personally. He visited on January 4, 1945. Mrs. Brunner walked him through the daily routine. Werner worked inside during winter months, she explained. He maintained equipment, processed seed inventory, handled accounting records. The war had taught her that German prisoners often had clerical skills. Why waste them on manual labor when she could do that work herself? The sheriff looked at Werner in the equipment barn where he was supposedly cataloging parts. The prisoner had lost weight. His skin looked pale, unhealthy. When asked about his duties, Werner recited a detailed explanation of the inventory system he was maintaining. Too detailed, too perfect, like he'd memorized it. Sheriff Merrick wrote in his report that the prisoner appeared physically unharmed and said he was properly housed and fed. He noted his concerns about the prisoner's appearance, but found no evidence of mistreatment that required intervention. The third complaint came from Margaret Sawyer, a widow who lived 6 miles south. She'd gone to bed early on February 2nd when sounds carried across the frozen fields. A man screaming, not words, just raw sound, then silence, then crying that went on for hours. She told the sheriff she almost didn't report it. What happened between a woman and her prisoner wasn't really her business, but the sound had been so desperate, so inhuman. Deputy Hartman returned to the Brunner farm on February 8th. Mrs. Brunner met him with patience wearing thin. She was tired of these disruptions. The prisoner sometimes had nightmares about the war, perfectly natural. She gave comfort when he was distressed. Was that now a crime? Werner was called. He confirmed having nightmares. He apologized if his distress had disturbed the neighbors. Mrs. Brunner was kind to help him through these episodes. Deputy Hartman closed the complaint. In his notes, he wrote something that showed more than he intended. Difficult to describe exact nature of concern. Prisoner states no mistreatment. Mrs. Brunner within her rights to manage her household. No evidence of improper conduct. That phrase hung in the file. Household management, as if Werner were furniture or livestock rather than a human being under military custody. The cultural framework of 1945 Nebraska had no vocabulary for what was happening on the Brunner farm. A wife could be brutal to a husband behind closed doors. Everyone knew this happened, but a woman keeping a man in chains, controlling him through physical dominance. That scenario existed outside the boundaries of what people could process or discuss, so the complaints were filed, investigated, and dismissed. Werner stayed exactly where he was, and the winter nights on the Brunner property grew longer and colder, while the neighboring farms turned away and tried not to hear what carried across the frozen fields. The Geneva Convention required neutral inspection of prisoner of war conditions. Switzerland served this function for German prisoners in American custody. Inspector Hans Müller arrived at the Brunner farm on March 15, 1945, accompanied by an American military escort. His report, kept in International Red Cross archives, documented a prisoner in obvious psychological distress trying to hide it. Müller interviewed Werner in the equipment barn with Mrs. Brunner standing 10 feet away. The prisoner answered questions in fluent German, his native language, but his responses were mechanical. Yes, he received adequate food. Yes, his sleeping quarters were appropriate. Yes, he had no complaints about his treatment. Müller noted Werner's body language contradicted every word. The prisoner flinched when Mrs. Brunner shifted her weight. His eyes tracked her constantly. When Müller asked about the marks on his wrists, now visible alongside those on his ankles, Werner explained he'd injured himself repairing machinery. The inspector requested a private medical examination. Mrs. Brunner initially refused, citing prisoner security concerns. The American escort officer stepped in. Geneva Convention rules were non-negotiable. The examination took place in the farmhouse kitchen with the escort officer present. Müller wrote down his findings with clinical precision: circular abrasions on both ankles consistent with prolonged restraint, similar marks on both wrists, significant weight loss since capture, approximately 25 pounds based on military intake records, signs of chronic sleep deprivation, elevated heart rate and blood pressure indicating sustained psychological stress. When asked directly about restraints, Werner's carefully built composure cracked. He admitted Mrs. Brunner sometimes chained him at night for security purposes to prevent escape attempts. He insisted this was reasonable given his status as enemy prisoner. Müller pushed further. How often was he restrained? Werner's answer came slowly. Most nights. Sometimes during the day when she left the property. Sometimes when she felt it was necessary. The inspector asked what made it necessary. Werner couldn't answer. He stared at the floor, breathing irregularly until Mrs. Brunner called from the next room asking if they were finished. Müller's report recommended immediate removal of prisoner Gottschalk from the Brunner farm. His assessment was clear. Subject displays psychological symptoms consistent with prolonged coercive control and isolation. Physical evidence confirms extended use of restraints beyond any legitimate security requirement. Current placement is harmful to prisoner welfare and potentially violates convention standards. The report went to the State Department, then to the War Department, then to the Prisoner of War Operations Division. The response came 6 weeks later. Farm production needs remained critical. Mrs. Brunner's farm produced significant food supplies for the war effort. The prisoner had been examined and found physically healthy. His own statements showed preference for current assignment over return to camp. Removal would set precedent for other prisoners to claim mistreatment to avoid work assignments. The recommendation was denied. Müller conducted a second inspection on July 9, 1945. By then, Germany had surrendered and return procedures were beginning. Werner's condition had gotten noticeably worse. He'd lost more weight. The restraint marks were deeper, more extensive. His psychological state had progressed to what Müller described as severe traumatic response to sustained captivity. This time, Müller's report went directly to the International Red Cross headquarters in Geneva with copies to multiple government agencies. His final assessment read, "This prisoner requires immediate psychiatric intervention and removal from current environment. Continued placement constitutes clear violation of convention protections. Recommend emergency extraction." The system ground slowly forward. Committees formed. Discussions happened. Meanwhile, Werner stayed chained in the Brunner farmhouse while summer heat baked the Nebraska plains and the war he'd been captured fighting ended an ocean away. Werner's mother wrote her first unanswered letter on October 3, 1944. She asked about his health, whether he was eating properly, if the American farmers treated him fairly. The Red Cross confirmed delivery to the Brunner farm address. No response came. She wrote again in November, then December, then every 2 weeks through the winter. Her handwriting grew increasingly desperate across the preserved pages. By March 1945, she was begging for any word that her son was alive. The Red Cross traced each letter. All confirmed delivered. None generated replies. What Werner's family couldn't know was that Mrs. Brunner collected his incoming mail personally and decided which letters he would see. Most she burned in the kitchen stove. A few she let him read while she watched, then took back before he could respond. She explained this as security protocol. Prisoners might encode escape plans in seemingly innocent letters. She was protecting American interests. Werner never asked why he couldn't answer his mother's letters. By late 1944, he'd stopped asking questions completely. Meanwhile, Mrs. Brunner's bank records told a different story about Werner's status on her farm. The Lancaster County First National Bank kept deposit records showing monthly payments into prisoner Gottschalk's prisoner account. The amounts matched standard farm labor wages, sometimes exceeding them. On paper, Werner was being paid for full-time farm work. The careful bookkeeping suggested a proper employer-prisoner relationship. Mrs. Brunner documented every cent, filed proper reports with the War Manpower Commission, kept perfect compliance with payment regulations, but the work those wages supposedly paid for didn't exist. Werner hadn't worked the fields since September. He hadn't maintained equipment, tended livestock, or done any of the tasks listed in Mrs. Brunner's detailed work logs. A camp administrator named Robert Vance, interviewed by historians in 1967, admitted the problem was known. Someone at the processing office noticed that Mrs. Brunner's production reports showed work completion impossible for a single worker. They raised questions about whether the prisoner was actually doing documented tasks. The inquiry went nowhere. Mrs. Brunner provided convincing work logs. Werner's account received proper wages. If the prisoner was being paid and not complaining, what exactly was the problem? Vance explained the administrative reality with uncomfortable honesty. Werner's situation was complicated. The prisoner himself had said to multiple inspectors that he preferred staying at the Brunner farm. He'd never formally requested transfer. Without a direct complaint from the prisoner, intervention became legally murky. The system was built on assumptions about how captivity worked. Prisoners wanted to escape. Captors were always male authority figures. Women couldn't physically dominate men. These assumptions created blind spots large enough to hide Werner Gottschalk's entire existence. His family in Bavaria kept writing through the spring of 1945. His younger sister wrote a letter describing their village's liberation by American forces. His father wrote about rebuilding their damaged home. His mother's letters became shorter, more formal, as if she was writing to someone she feared might already be dead. All these letters arrived at the Brunner farm. All were signed for by Helga Brunner at the mailbox. Most ended as ash in her kitchen stove, while Werner stayed chained upstairs, unaware that his family spent every day waiting for words he was never allowed to send. The last letter his mother wrote during the war was dated August 1, 1945. She asked a simple question: "Werner, are you still my son, or has America taken even that from me?" He never saw it. By the time someone thought to ask why Werner Gottschalk hadn't written home in nearly a year, the answer was too complicated to acknowledge and too shameful to document. Harold Tesmer sold farm equipment across 5 Nebraska counties. On March 23, 1945, he was driving the back road past the Brunner property when he saw something that made him stop his truck. A man was running through the cornfield stubble about 200 yards from the road. Running badly, stumbling every few steps. Even from a distance, Tesmer could see metal shining around the man's ankles. He was still wearing chains. Tesmer grabbed his binoculars. The man was extremely thin, dressed in clothes that hung loose on his frame. His face was twisted with effort and terror. He kept looking back toward the farmhouse, running despite the obvious pain each step caused. Then Tesmer saw Mrs. Brunner come out of the barn. She moved with frightening speed for someone her size, crossing the field in long strides that closed the distance rapidly. She wasn't calling out or shouting. She pursued in silence, methodical and relentless. Werner made it perhaps 50 more yards before his legs gave out. He collapsed face first into the partially frozen earth. Mrs. Brunner reached him within seconds, hauled him upright by his shirt collar, and began dragging him back toward the house. Tesmer drove straight to the county sheriff's office. He gave his statement to Sheriff Merrick with shaking hands. He described the chains, the prisoner's condition, the way Mrs. Brunner had pursued him like livestock that had broken fence. The sheriff's report described the incident differently. Prisoner escape attempt was the official designation. Mrs. Brunner had properly maintained security of enemy personnel assigned to her custody. The report praised her for quick response and effective recapture. Sheriff Merrick visited the farm the following day. Werner sat in the front room with fresh bruising on his face and hands. Mrs. Brunner explained that the prisoner had become violent during the escape attempt. She'd been forced to physically restrain him. The injuries were regrettable but necessary. Werner confirmed her account. He'd tried to escape. She'd stopped him. He'd resisted. The bruises were his own fault. The sheriff asked about the chains Tesmer had reported. Brunner produced leg irons from a storage closet, standard restraint equipment, she explained. She'd applied them after 2 previous escape attempts. Given this third attempt, stronger security measures were clearly justified. She requested official authorization for continuous restraint. The prisoner had proven himself a persistent escape risk. She needed formal approval to maintain appropriate security rules. Sheriff Merrick's report included recommendations that were put into effect immediately. Additional security measures authorized. Continuous restraint approved during high-risk periods. No limit specified on what constituted high-risk periods or duration of restraint. The paperwork made it legal. Mrs. Bruner could now keep Werner chained indefinitely with official county approval. No one checked Werner's physical condition beyond documenting that he was alive. No one asked why a prisoner who'd been supposedly compliant for months would suddenly try to escape. No one questioned whether the escape attempt itself might show desperation rather than criminality. Harold Tesmer tried filing a complaint with the War Department directly. His letter was forwarded to the camp administration, which forwarded it to county authorities, which returned it to Sheriff Merrick, who had already closed the case. Tesmer told his wife that night he'd watched a man being hunted across a field like an animal. She told him to stay out of it. The war made people do strange things. Mrs. Bruner was managing an enemy prisoner the best way she knew how. It wasn't their business what happened on someone else's property. Werner didn't try to escape again. Whatever part of him that still hoped for freedom died somewhere in that frozen cornfield on March 23rd. After that, he simply endured. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. For thousands of German prisoners across America, return planning began immediately. Werner Gottschalk's name appeared on the initial transport lists for June departure. Then it disappeared. Mrs. Bruner filed legal documents with Lancaster County Court on May 22nd. She claimed outstanding labor debts. Werner owed her 3 months of work to make up for his escape attempts, the security measures they'd required, and the administrative burden of managing a difficult prisoner. She calculated the debt at $420. Her attorney argued that releasing Werner before satisfaction of this debt would be breach of contract and financial harm to a productive American farm. The prisoner labor program operated under legal agreements. Those agreements had terms that must be honored. The county judge, Martin Holloway, scheduled hearings. Werner stayed at the Bruner farm during the legal proceedings. His status shifted into bureaucratic limbo. Not quite prisoner of war anymore since the war had ended. Not quite free since he was subject to ongoing legal claims. The hearings stretched through June and July. Mrs. Bruner attended every session with careful documentation. Work logs, wage records, security incident reports, all perfectly kept. Her case appeared ironclad on paper. Werner attended in leg irons. Mrs. Bruner explained this was necessary given his history of escape attempts. Judge Holloway allowed it. The Red Cross representative who'd been trying to access Werner since Inspector Mueller's reports finally gained entry during the legal proceedings. Dr. Elizabeth Winters conducted her examination in a courthouse holding room on July 18th. Her report was devastating. Werner had lost 43 pounds since his initial capture weight. His psychological state matched clinical definitions of severe trauma. He showed symptoms consistent with prolonged captivity under coercive control beyond anything normal prisoner of war conditions would produce. The restraint injuries were extensive and permanent. Nerve damage in both ankles would affect his mobility for life. Dr. Winters asked Werner direct questions about his treatment at the Bruner farm. He answered in a monotone voice, staring at the wall behind her. Mrs. Bruner provided adequate food. The restraints were for security. He understood why they were necessary. He had no complaints. She asked if he wanted to return to Germany. The question seemed to confuse him. He looked at her for the first time, and she later wrote that his eyes were completely empty. Eventually, he said yes. He supposed he wanted to go home. Dr. Winters submitted her report with urgent recommendations for immediate psychological help. Werner needed professional treatment for trauma. He needed removal from Mrs. Bruner's custody immediately. Legal proceedings be damned. The judge ruled on August 2nd. Mrs. Bruner's labor debt claims were legitimate, but would be satisfied through wage garnishment from Werner's prisoner account rather than additional physical labor. Werner was released to Red Cross custody for return processing. Bruner received her full contractual payment from the War Manpower Commission, 420 plus accumulated wages, plus a completion bonus for successful management of prisoner labor through the entire war period. Werner was processed through the return center in Chicago on August 15, 1945. Medical staff noted his physical condition and psychological state with concern. They recommended follow-up treatment in Germany. No one recommended prosecution of Helga Bruner. No investigation was opened into his treatment. The legal system had examined the case and found her documentation adequate. The prisoner himself had never formally accused her of wrongdoing. Werner boarded a transport ship on August 23rd. He'd spent exactly 18 months and 2 days on the Bruner farm. The chains were finally removed, but whatever freedom meant, Werner Gottschalk no longer seemed capable of recognizing it. Werner arrived in Bavaria on September 7, 1945. His family met him at the processing center in Munich. His mother later described the reunion in a letter kept by his sister. She wrote that Werner looked at them as if through glass, present but unreachable. He spoke rarely during those first months home. When asked about America, about the farm, about his time as a prisoner, he would stare silently until someone changed the subject. His family learned not to ask. The chains had left permanent marks. His ankles had deep scarring that never fully healed. He walked with a slight limp that doctors couldn't entirely explain through physical injury alone. Something in his walk suggested he was still making up for weight that was no longer there. He never discussed Helga Brunner, not once in 38 years. Meanwhile, in Nebraska, the local newspapers published nothing about Werner's case. The Lincoln Journal carried brief notices about prisoner return schedules. The County Weekly mentioned Mrs. Brunner's successful farm production during the war years. No connection was drawn between these items. State Department memos made public decades later showed the deliberate suppression. A communication dated August 10, 1945 outlined concerns about potentially embarrassing publicity regarding prisoner labor program irregularities. The memo specifically mentioned the Brunner case as presenting unique public relations challenges. Another memo from September discussed avoiding international incident regarding treatment of enemy prisoners. Germany was defeated, but the diplomatic implications remained sensitive. Documentation of an American woman keeping a German soldier in chains for 18 months would undermine narratives about American moral superiority and proper treatment of prisoners. The solution was simple. Say nothing. File the reports in restricted archives. Pay Mrs. Brunner her contractual amounts to prevent any complaint she might publicize. Process Werner through return quickly and quietly. Mrs. Brunner received a final payment from the War Manpower Commission on September 21, 1945. The amount totaled $347 for prisoner labor services rendered. She deposited at Lancaster County First National Bank the same day. She never spoke publicly about Werner. When neighbors occasionally asked about her wartime prisoner, she described him as adequate labor who'd required firm management. Nothing more remarkable than that. Former prisoners from the Nebraska camps were interviewed by historians in the 1980s as part of an oral history project. Several men remembered rumors about a widow who kept her prisoner differently than other farms. They recalled whispered stories in the camp barracks about someone who disappeared into rural isolation. One veteran named Klaus Hoffman described hearing about the giant widow's prisoner from other prisoners. He said everyone knew something wrong was happening, but no one knew exactly what. The camps were full of rumors. This one lasted longer than most. When researchers tried to investigate, they found the official records frustratingly sparse. Werner's file had standard processing paperwork, wage records, and transport documents. The inspection reports with their concerning findings were buried in separate archives under different filing systems. No charges were ever filed against Helga Brunner. No investigation was opened beyond the wartime inspections that had already occurred. The legal proceedings about labor debts were civil matters resolved through standard contract law. The case simply disappeared into bureaucratic silence. A woman had kept a man in chains for 18 months with full knowledge of military and civilian authorities. Everyone who could have stepped in chose not to, and when the war ended, everyone who knew about it decided that some stories were better left untold. Werner Gottschalk's silence about his captivity wasn't choice or healing. It was the final act of a system that had failed him so completely that even speaking the truth seemed impossible. Werner Gottschalk died in Bavaria on March 12, 1983. He was 62 years old. The death certificate listed heart failure as the cause. His obituary mentioned his service in the war, his capture, his return home. It said nothing about Nebraska. His family held a small funeral. His sister mentioned to an attending cousin that Werner had never been the same after America. The cousin asked what happened there. The sister said she didn't know. Werner never told them. Whatever he experienced on the Brunner farm, he carried it silently to his grave. Helga Brunner lived 28 years longer than the man she'd kept in chains. She died in 1978 at age 84, still living on the same 400 acres. Her obituary in the county newspaper celebrated her as a pioneering independent farmer who'd maintained successful operations through wartime labor shortages. Local historians remembered her as a tough woman who'd managed her property with exceptional discipline. No one mentioned Werner Gottschalk in her obituary. No one mentioned prisoner labor at all. The property was sold to a family from Iowa. They found equipment in the barns, furniture in the house, decades of accumulated farm materials. If they found chains or leg irons, they never reported it. Such items wouldn't have seemed unusual on a working farm anyway. The documentation of Werner's captivity exists scattered across multiple archives. Inspector Mueller's reports are in International Red Cross files in Geneva. Lieutenant Kowalski's inspection is buried in War Department records at the National Archives. The county sheriff's reports remain in Lancaster County storage. Dr. Winters' medical assessment is filed with return records in Chicago. No single place contains the complete story. A researcher would need to know exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. The bureaucratic fragmentation that enabled Werner's captivity also ensured its obscurity. The case reveals something deeply uncomfortable about how systems fail. Werner was inspected, documented, and evaluated by multiple authorities. Everyone noted problems. Everyone filed reports. No one acted decisively because the situation didn't match templates for intervention. A woman couldn't be an abuser in the framework of 1940s America. Male captivity by a female captor existed outside administrative possibility. The prisoner himself said he preferred his current placement, which officials accepted at face value without examining why someone might say such things under pressure. The system was built on assumptions that blinded everyone involved. And Werner paid the price for those assumptions with 18 months of his life that left scars permanent enough to last 38 years more. If the chains still exist somewhere in Nebraska, stored in a barn or buried in a field, they carry no signs explaining their purpose. They're anonymous metal, impossible to tell apart from thousands of other farm tools scattered across the rural Midwest. History remembers wars through monuments and museums. It documents battles and political decisions. It rarely keeps stories like Werner's because they're too complicated, too uncomfortable, too resistant to simple narratives about good and evil. But the absence of memorials doesn't mean these events didn't happen. Somewhere in Bavaria, Werner Gottschalk's grave has his name and dates. Somewhere in Nebraska, 400 acres of farmland still produce crops on soil where a man once ran in chains toward freedom he would never reach. The silence around his story isn't an accident. It's the final chapter of a system that worked exactly as designed, protecting itself by making certain truths too difficult to speak and too inconvenient to remember. If you found this story as haunting as we did, hit that like button. These forgotten histories need to be told. Subscribe so you never miss the dark truths hiding in plain sight throughout American history. The past isn't always what we've been taught. Sometimes it's worse. And sometimes the worst part is that everyone knew and no one stopped it.